I'd just like to welcome everybody. Hope that you had a marvelous Thanksgiving and first couple days of Chanukah. I have to admit, very strange feeling of, as far as I can remember, the past 8 or so decades, that we had Hanukkah dinner with leftover turkey, stuffing, sweet potato casserole, and latkes. And it's a very strange combination, but it seemed to work because everybody ate everything. So I hope you all enjoyed it. And we look forward to the remaining days of Hanukkah. Our speaker this morning obviously needs no introduction. And it's a great pleasure that Spice is able to have Rabbi Knight present for us this morning. Thank you for being with us. Great.
Thank you. It is good to see everyone here this morning. I'm having some technological challenges today, so I apologize. It's going to require me to sort of communicate to Tracy and to ask her to sort of share various different texts. Tracy, is it possible to take off your paragraph marker?
Yes.
Thank you.
What?
So in the event, I want to sort of talk about just briefly about sort of, and actually, Tracy, why don't you take it off, and then I'll speak directly, and then you can work on that, and then we'll ask you to share.
Okay.
Sort of why I chose this text. So there has been, as you might imagine, a lot of conversations about sort of the dilemmas of faith and the challenges of faith at this moment in this time. And it happened a lot actually around the High Holy Days. Around the High Holy Days, I had a lot of individuals contact me and say, Rabbi, I'm just I'm personally really struggling right now about how to have faith in this moment. And I've had some coffees with members people who've just, sitting outside at a Starbucks, people who have really struggled with how to have faith in this moment, right? As we sort of have continued on in the pandemic, as we've continued on to, even as recently as this last week, someone contacted me, with regards to Omicron, and said how much more can we take? And so as I was sort of thinking about what to teach, and also thinking about Hanukkah itself, I thought that it was a good idea to potentially tackle some of the questions around faith, use some Hasidic texts that are not easy and are quite complicated, and you might have real problems with, and that's okay, right? And so we're going to explore some of the Hasidic texts that are old, but also sort of remind ourselves to place ourselves in this holiday of Hanukkah. And so, first off, happy Hanukkah to everyone, right? It's wonderful to have leftover turkey and everything for Hanukkah, and that's great. And at the same time, it is just wonderful to be in the celebration of Hanukkah. I will tell you that for us, Hanukkah, Robert, as you were saying, it came up awfully quick. We were sort of were prepared, but not really prepared for Hanukkah. We actually went away out of town to my wife's family, to be with my wife's family for an unveiling of my wife's grandmother's for her gravestone, and we came back to town, and all of a sudden realized that we two rabbis we had prepared everything for Hanukkah except for the candles, and we're like, oh my gosh, we don't have Hanukkah candles. This is just ridiculous. And so we actually we had a kit that we had at home for a long time where we could make our own candles and wrap, take beeswax and wrap up our own candles. So for the first night, we actually rolled our own candles. And the experience of that, I quickly went out and got candles the next day myself. It was those candles were not very good. So it sort of came up on us pretty quickly, but in this dark time that we're in, I want to recognize that that if you think about sort of the scope of history, this is not the only dark time that we've been in. The story of Hanukkah itself is a story of a time in which there was, in fact, darkness in the land of Israel and pain and suffering and misery and war. That actually took the Maccabees 2 years, right? It took the Maccabees 2 years to actually defeat, which is an unbelievable miracle in of itself, to defeat the Syrian Greeks, right? And I thought about it, earlier. I think Sarah said to me about I was at Providence Day last night. We had a lot of Temple Bethel members at Providence Day. We had the Brotherhood event last night. We've had multiple different nights of events and things going on. We've been meeting tonight of Jewish leaders in the community. And you think about where we were 1 year ago, right? And we couldn't even gather. There were no vaccines. December 20th is when healthcare providers sort of started receiving vaccines for the first time. So if you think about like the darkness, and then you think about sort of the progression and the resilience that we can have, it's important to I think it's just important to remember that even in all of the darkness that we have, sort of two things. One is it's important to have some resilience. It may take time. It's not going to happen overnight. For all of the whiz bang bam boom, modern, immediate gratification that we have about like how things should change immediately, it's just not the way of the world. We sometimes forget that. And the question I think that Hanukkah, the sort of spiritual question that Hanukkah provides for us is, what is the light that both we need, and what is the light that we can become to dispel the darkness? Right? What is, from a spiritual perspective, if the shamash is the helper candle that lights the light and helps to dispel the darkness, what's the light that we bring? What's the light that we bring into the world and help to dispel the darkness? So that's all a setup for this notion, this idea that it is dark out there, right? Like there are times where it's not great, and it's physically dark at night. Like this is the darkest season, one of the darkest seasons of the darkest season of the year. And then what is our agency? What's our power to bring light into the world? In addition to that, in the Hasidic text that we're going to look at today, what I want to also recognize is that the Hasidic movement is interested in how you find God in the darkness, and also it's very interested in like, what is your personal practice, right? How do we define faith in this time, in this moment, right? What's your personal practice in defining, for yourself, how faith can help provide the inner light, the inner godliness, and that spark to help to dispel the darkness too. So let's take a look at some texts. I want to be fully transparent. You may like some of these texts, and you may think some of these texts are absolutely terrible, and you would never, and you might not like them at all, and that's okay. But they're texts from our tradition that I think are worthwhile to sort of look at. So let's take Tracy, were you able to take the paragraph marks out and to do the sharing? And I'm so sorry to ask you to do the sharing because I can't. My computer somehow not letting me share any documents right now. All right. So if you'll scroll, so Christ is faith, searching for light in a darkened world, and I want to also invite participants to read, if you would like, if that's okay. Would someone be willing to read this out loud? But don't volunteer all at once. Definitely not.
Rabbi, I'll read some.
All right, sounds great.
Something's going on this. Okay.
Yeah, there we go.
There we go. Dark times, in the broader sense I propose here, are as such not identical with the monstrosities of this century, which indeed are of a horrible novelty. Dark times, in contrast, are not only not new, they are no rarity in history, although they were perhaps unknown in American history, which otherwise has its fair share, past and present, of crime and disaster. That even in the darkest of times, we have the right to expect some illumination, and that such illumination may well come less from theories and concepts than from their uncertain, flickering, and often weak light, light that some men and women in their lives and their works will kindle under almost all circumstances and shed over the time span that was given them on earth. Eyes so used to darkness as ours will hardly be able to tell whether their light was the light of a candle or that of a blazing sun.
All right, so let's just stay here for a moment and just sort of think about, let's stay right there, and let's just think about sort of what Hannah Arendt is saying. So let's give a contextualization about sort of where she is and what's happening in 1968. What is she really speaking about? Would anyone want to sort of participate? Please unmute yourself, and I'll try to look at it. You can raise your hand in Zoom, but if you want to unmute yourself, what is Hannah Arendt really sort of getting at?
Bad things have happened all through history. This is not something new. There are always bad times, and then there are good times that overcome the bad times, and we have to look at that, and we should shed some of the light into the darkness.
Right. So we're not the first generation of people who've experienced bad times. And sometimes in 1968, like there are some bad times that have been like unbelievably dark, right? Unbelievably dark. This century, right, in the 1900s, right, between the two world wars, between the Holocaust, you sort of think through all of the different things that happened. Multiple wars beyond that, Korean War, and the dawn of the nuclear age, and the destruction of the nuclear bombs brought. You sort of look at all of the potential dark experience, and there's a real question as to is this time different than others? And you look back at other times in history, and in fact, it doesn't necessarily mean that the scale of destruction is really high. In last century, and it's not totally unique. I'm actually listening to a history right now of Rome. I'm listening to a podcast that's talking about the history of Rome. I don't know how I got onto this podcast, but it's been like completely addicting. And I remember studying Roman history when I was like in fourth grade, and not really much since. So it's bringing back Mrs. Priest from my fourth grade year, and everything that she taught me. But she was a wonderful teacher. But I'm listening to this history of Rome, and it's like it's pretty dark, right? Like it is pretty dark. Listening to the history of Rome, and so we sort of get at is that the question for us, right, is that there's people who are here who are the shamash, right? It might be you, it might be other people that but that there are men and women who in their lives and in what they do with their lives, right, under kindle somehow under the most, and she says under all these circumstances somehow they shed light with their lives, right? And what is the sort of faith that has to happen in order for us to be able to do that, right? And I think that's a real question. If you look at this last couple of years, who are the individuals and what are the people, and how are we in this moment of darkness? How are we choosing to shed light as well? So let's go down further. And just as an illustration of this, nothing big. This is just actually Chanukah in the night of Jerusalem, all lit up, and showing the public display of the Chanukah in Jerusalem. That's just a picture of what that might look like. What that looks like often walking around in certain neighborhoods in Jerusalem. Let's continue down. All right. So now we're going to get to Rabbi Nachman of Braslav. Now, I think it's important to recognize a couple of things as we get to this piece of Rabbi Nachman of Braslav. So, first thing is that the Hasidic sources, and some of the Hasidic sources that we're going to look at, they approach faith as an encounter with the divine presence, rather than a theological system. And it suggests that spiritual obstacles, that longing and yearning are actually all important components in the search for God. And specifically, Rabbi Nachman of Braslav, in this, God is in the thick of the cloud, this statement, it's important to recognize that he is the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement. He's his great grandson. And Rabbi Nachman of Braslav lived from 1772 to about 1810. It was actually a short life. And he was also known as being someone who was manic depressive, that he had sort of sometimes dramatic and impulsive and ecstatic and amazingly artistic talents. And he as a manic depressive, often, a lot of the manic depressives, there's a lot of different names for that now, but bipolar often is one of them. Often, goes from through the poles of being manic and or depressed, right? So that bipolar is sort of sort of the common language that we hear manic depressive today. And very often we hear that today. All right, so his idea, one thing that as we get to, is that I think it's just important to say is that he begins with a warning, right? I want to give this to you beforehand, a warning that if you live most of your life in what he says is materiality, that if you live your sort of focus on the materials of things around you, that it often is difficult to awaken to God's presence, when the urge sort of arises for you to sort of jump on the spiritual bandwagon. So if you live sort of focus on material things, when all of a sudden something happens in your life, then you want to jump on the spiritual bandwagon. Sometimes it's really hard to do so, right? It's hard to sort of like get into a sense of faith when you're focused in on so much of the day-to-day life. And he sees God as having a sense of judgment, but also sees God as having a sense of just absolute mercy and love. And that mercy and love that God has overrides God's judgment. And so what he gets at is sort of, where do we find God in moments where it might be most difficult. So with that, that's my introduction to this text. Not an easy text that we're about to read. Would someone be interested and willing to read this out loud?
I will.
All right. And Sarah, if I interrupt, it's not you, it's me. You know me well enough to know that. And yes, that I might just be clarifying something. Okay.
Mm-hmm. So the people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick cloud where God was.
Right. So this is from Exodus, right? And they're at Mount Sinai. The people are at Mount Sinai, and there's a thick cloud that's covering Mount Sinai. And the people, right, they see this thick cloud and they step back. Moses steps in to the cloud, right? And so that cloud sort of represents the darkness that exists, right? Do you step back? Do you hold back? Or do you step in, right? That's what they're sort of getting at. That's the proof text for his writing. Sarah, let's continue.
If one spends one's entire life in materiality and later gets enthusiastic and wants to follow God's path, then the quality of judgment argues against that person and doesn't allow him to follow God's ways and create a hindrance for him. But God desires kindness and leniency and hides God's self, as it were, in that hindrance. And one who is aware looks at the hindrance and finds there the Creator, as it says in Jerusalem Talmud. If someone says to you, "Where is your God?" you shall say to that person, "In a great city in Aram." Where's Aram?
I think it's in like today. I have to double check. I want to double check, but I can find that out for you.
As it says, God calls to me from seer. And one who is not aware when one sees the hindrance immediately moves away from it. The hindrance is like a thick cloud, for a thick cloud is dark and a hindrance is dark. The words darkness and hindrance, or that which holds back, share the same three Hebrew letters, Het, Shin, Kaf. As it is written in Genesis 22:16, you have not withheld your son. This is the meaning of the verse. So the people remain at the distance. When they see the thick cloud, namely the hindrance, they remain at a distance. But Moses, who represents the quality of awareness for all of Israel, approached the thick cloud where God was. Namely, he approached the hindrance where the blessed God is actually hidden.
All right, let's stop right there. Hold on, go back up, don't move down quite yet. Let's go, let's just stop right there. All right. So this cloud that is on Mount Sinai that he's really, speaking about is that he's inferring that this cloud is not really cloud at all, but this is the hindrance. This is the darkness. This is the thing that sort of prevents us from becoming what we were meant to become. These are the darknesses that exist in our lives, right? And I think it's important to recognize that we're very often, we're trained to think about hindrances or obstacles as something that we need to bypass or somehow jump over in order to find a place of brightness, a place of clarity, a place of faith. But what Rabbi Nachman is sort of teaching here is that perhaps instead of thinking about it as something to avoid, as something to jump over and to bypass, perhaps we should go into that dark place. Perhaps we should go into that cloud and actually confront it. Because in this hindrance, in this darkness, in this moment, this may be where, in fact, we encounter God. Right? That God isn't just in the bright places and in the happy, go lucky places, but actually God may be in the darkness. God may be in the very hindrance, the very thing that we think is preventing us from having faith. Maybe that's the thing that we need to confront. And maybe that in that hindrance, right, is actually God. So let's scroll down now just a little, and you'll see where it says we heard more of this teaching. Sarah, do you want to continue? You did a great job.
Sure.
Oh, by the way, Aram is right. That's the Aramean area. So where the Aramean tribes are. All right.
We heard more of this teaching directly from the holy Reb Nachman, that God actually hides God's self in the hindrance. Scriptures say God loves justice and God loves Israel, but the love with which God loves Israel is greater than the love with which God loves justice. Questionable. Thus, when the quality of judgment argues against one who is not really worthy of coming close to God because God loves justice, God is compelled, as it were, to agree to the arising of hindrances on the path. These hindrances are indeed the result, the result of that person's evil deeds. After all, God cannot ignore just consequences since God loves justice.
All right, I told you, not going to necessarily love all these texts, right? There's going to be pieces that we may not agree with, but that's okay. You hold that too. That might be your hindrance, right? So don't, just keep. That's okay. Keep. Tracy, if you can scroll down just a little more. Okay.
Because God loves Israel even more than God loves justice, that does God do. What does God do? God is forced to agree to the hindrances of the sake of justice. However, despite this, the truest truth is that God wants that person to be able to draw close to God. So God gives permission to place the hindrances in the way, but God hides God's self in the hindrances. One who is aware, more mindful, can find God in the midst of the hindrances themselves. They really are not hindrances in the world at all, because in the hindrances themselves is found the Holy One. Through the hindrances themselves, in fact, one might draw closer to God, because that is where God is hidden. And this is the meaning of Moses approached the thick cloud. That is the hindrance, for that is where God was.
All right, let's just, I'm gonna pause right now. All right, so here's, I think, the important component of this, which is really, and I'll open up for questions. If people have questions, you can put them in the chat box. I haven't actually checked the chat box. Janice wrote that we had also the Crusades and Inquisition. Those were definitely dark times. There was definitely dark moments, the Crusades and Inquisition. All right. So what I said, you might not like this, right? But I think it's totally understandable if you don't. But I want to sort of draw out at least a concept that I think Rabbi Nachman is really understanding. So he's understanding that the moment at Sinai when the Israelites, sort of see the dark cloud and they step back, Moses, on the other hand, sees this dark cloud and he steps into the thick of that cloud and has an encounter with God. And in that way, he's lifting up Moses as a role model for Jews to embrace the obstacles, to embrace the hindrances on our life journey and on the journey of faith. And what I think it's important to notice is that Rabbi Nachman is not talking about faith in a perspective of like religious dogma, right? He's not saying that faith is all about your Shabbat practice. Faith is all about your, whether or not you say, all blessings for everything every single day. Faith is not like, this is not about the purpose is not like about a dogmatic religion. What he's saying here, I think, which I think is important, is that he's opening up the question of life experience. What are the fears? What are the doubts? What are the dynamics that we face in our lives? What are the hindrances? What are the challenges that we really have? And he explores how, a sort of question, which is that in this moment, can we find God? Right? In this moment, is there a domain of faith, and not really just looking at it as an intellectual thing, and not really looking at the dynamics that we're facing in our lives by trying to sort of like skirt around it, but actually sort of going into the thick of it, right? Ellen, you have a question, by all means, please.
Well, I don't have a question, I have a comment. I mean, I think this is very in line with, in our darkest moments, our defenses get more stripped down. And I think that we have more awareness. And I think that goes with materialism. I think he was talking more about stripping things away and being more in touch. I remember going to a retreat, and I was really young, but there were a lot of older people there, and they were asking where you found God and faith. And almost every story was, my parent was dying, and I remember being, why would that be? I just was clueless. But I do think in some of the hardest times, it really strips you down and you get more to the core. I mean, it's not enjoyable. It's really is bad. But I think that it, by necessity, just takes a lot of the layers away and you get more real.
Yeah. Amalia, you said it right. It's the question is not, where is Aram is important, but sort of what is the purpose of Aram in that text, and I think that is actually really important, which is this sort of notion that Aram is sort of is seen as an enemy, but also seen as a hindrance, right? And yet, even in the most difficult hindrances, even as the most difficult situations that we arise, God does not leave our side, and that is true for all of us, right? God is with you. God loves you. God's compassion is for you. You might have hindrances. And the question is then, even in those moments, know that God is with you. And even in these moments, know that like there may be a sense of godliness in there. Amalia, I want to make sure that I got what you were saying correctly. Is that okay? All right, great. Thank you. Anyone have challenged by this? It doesn't sit well with you. Bob immediately raised his hand. Go for it, Bob.
Yeah, no, I just think, and see what Ellen was saying, there are times in our lives when things don't go right. And we're concerned about our faith. We're challenged by faith. And the hindrance very often is a direct affront to our faith. It could be illness. It could be the misdirection of a loved one, doing things you just don't understand or like. Or it could be broader than that in the society in which you live. But it's only in times of stress when you really can make progress in your own understanding and confront God in the broad sense of the word. It's very easy to go along when things are going well and say, oh, I believe in God and I do this and I do the other. But when you're struck with something that really is catastrophic in your life, be it societal or just personal, then you have to really, you can either run, you can be the ostrich, you can hide, or you have to confront it. And that's really when breakthroughs occur. That's really when your ability to understand yourself and where you sit in relationship to humanity, to the broader things, including what I guess we would call God. Because I think that's kind of difficult for me to define sometimes.
Right. And so often people will say, right, their biggest faith questions emerge in these dark moments, right? And well, where is God? Where is God? Why is God not making it all nice and wonderful and perfect, and sunny day with rainbows and unicorns, right? But like, that's actually not that. And what at least Rabbi Nachman is saying, like, that's not. And it's interesting, like as a man, I've heard manic depressive, right? That I was saying earlier, right? Think about his own life. He died pretty young, right? Lived in a time that wasn't so great. And what he's saying, Rabbi Nachman is saying is like, don't just look for the sunny days, look for the dark stuff too. And a God who is in all of it is there, right? You got to find, right?
And I think just in addition to that God doesn't come to us. We have to go to God.
Yeah, absolutely. Sam, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I detected in the reading that actually God made the hindrances, that because people don't do right or don't live in a particular way, they were imposed for people to have to struggle with.
Yeah, I was sort of hoping that you wouldn't pick up on that, but yeah, just kidding. Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually a part that people. I was actually thinking that people would. That's the part that people would have the most difficulty with, right? Like, it is God playing puppet master, right, to our lives. I think that Rabbi Nachman would have seen much more God playing much more of that kind of role within our individual lives than personally I would. I have a real difficulty with the notion that because he is saying something that is actually also important, which is that there is no fire at all. Like, don't worry, it's not that the fire isn't totally real. It is our perception of the world, and we're limited in our ability to see. And I think that works for some people, but I think that's actually really problematic for some people too, in that the hindrances, the idea that God is actually creating hindrances for us to experience, can be really problematic. Like, what kind of all-loving, all-knowing God would do that to us? And where the push comes to shove is that when it gets into questions of really difficult hindrances, it's very difficult to see an all-loving, all-powerful God. It's very difficult to see humans being divinely punished for something that we did, and that God is actually, creating those hindrances for us. So while that exists within the writing, and I didn't want to just remove it and sort of cherry pick what it's being said, I agree, Sam. That is for me, the most difficult aspect of this text. And I'm whether or not this is right or wrong, choosing to see light in what I think he's actually arguing a little, which is also to sort of say, in these, we all have these dark moments, and how can you find a light in them? But I agree, that is the problematic piece for sure. Yep, Sarah.
He says that God values Israel over justice. Did I read that?
Yeah, and I think that's also, I think that's a piece of just sort of he values like, at the end of the day, mercy and compassion and love for his people is over whether or not there's going to be divine punishment for something, I think is what he's getting at.
Okay.
Let's go on to the next text. Is that okay? And if you can share the next text, Tracy. Great. So let's continue down. Great. So this is a poem by Zelda called "There Are Those Who Think." And would someone be willing to read? It's very quick and not very complicated poem. Marcia, please.
Zelda, there are those who think. There are those who think that if a person is religious, then their faith, as it were, sits in a box. They don't understand that every single day, the believer must renew his faith. Question: what does it mean for one's faith to sit in a box? Do you want me to keep going?
No, let's stop right there. Let's ponder that question a little. Or if you want to answer it, you can. But if not, let's ponder that question. What does it mean for someone's faith to sit in a box?
To me, that would mean that they have predefined boundaries.
Okay. Great. Anyone else? Predefined boundaries. That's great.
To me, it sounds like, I have my faith. It's over there, but I live my life. I don't think about it. I just keep moving along. But yeah, over there's that faith thing going on.
Okay, great.
I don't have to do anything because it's just there.
Yeah. David?
It's like Dr. Pangloss in Candide, where everything has a purpose in the world if we could just understand it. The British philosopher Bradley, who was not Jewish, said that this is the best of all possible worlds in which everything is the necessary evil. And there are those of us who believe that anytime we would try to improve upon the world that God created, it becomes worse. So we understand that there's a magnitude out there that we can't understand. And as it were, that understanding sits in a box, whose contents we hope we can penetrate and understand to some extent. And I think that describes the kind of faith that sits in a box.
Thank you. Janice, please.
It's hard to follow you, David, but I have a different view, having started out with Judaism in Orthodoxy and then conservative, more towards Orthodox, is that it dictates and practices that one could rely on, that defines certain people's view of religion, and I think this text goes much further in that God is all around us, and your faith has to be constant and not rely on just those things.
So what I would sort of like make a slight change to that is that I think that for me, what the Zelda poem highlights in the approach to faith is that faith is something faith is not something that is or is not, right? It is not absent and it's not present. Faith is more dynamic than it is static. And in that dynamism, faith is something that we're sort of constantly trying to figure out how to renew. right? And the things that we go on, the things that go on in our life, like as she says, as Zelda says, right? That don't understand that every single day, right? We have to go through the thick of the cloud every single day. We have to sort of confront the realities of the world that we live in. Every single day, we're confronted by a diagnosis, a loved one who's in pain. Every single day, right? There are pieces that of life that have to be confronted, and it doesn't mean that faith, that means that by virtue of that effectively faith is something that is renewed day by day, daily, right, by our experiences and by the things we confront. And sometimes it means that we feel it strongly, and sometimes we feel like it's absent, right? And that's okay. That's absolutely okay.
But if something's left in a box unused, it's lost.
That's also, that's beautiful too. Yeah. Or unpracticed. Yeah. All right. So let's go to the next.
Asher.
Yeah. Please.
If it's sitting in a box, I agree with Sarah. It's sitting in a box over here, and I'll pull it out when I need it. Not, it's not something that lives within me, that walks within me, that is who I am. It might not be the same intensity all the time, but a box is over here.
Right. It's not integrated
really in me.
Yeah.
And one more thing about the cloud, if we go back to Genesis, or you don't want me to do that.
I would always encourage people to go back to Genesis. By all means, go back to Genesis.
When the cloud appeared, the people down below the mountain did not feel God's presence. And they needed to feel the presence, which was why they made the idol. Yeah.
Right. So they tried to fill their lives with the very thing that they were, so that was feeling absent, to them. Right. That's a beautiful rabbinic. You come by it naturally with it, clearly in terms of the strong rabbinic family that you have taught and raised. But that's a great rabbinic point. Like they fill their lives with a thing that they feel is absent. And I think, by the way, that also happens to each of us, right? Very often when we feel like we are confronted with a darkness or something, we try to often feel we sort of fill our lives with lots of different things to sort of feel to feel something, right? To feel, to actually feel whatever it might be. And sometimes that's materiality, right? As Reb Nachman sort of talked about, sometimes that's substances, frankly, right? Like there's lots of different, it could be food, right? In my family, fortunately or unfortunately, often food was language of love, right? And very often when dark times, that could be food, but it could also be, things that are healthy and things that are unhealthy, right? And so, and in this case, right, the golden calf is sort of that thing that they're trying to fill that void that they feel. And part of the question might be, had they entered the cloud, not just to feel God's presence, but had they actually not stepped back from the hindrance, maybe they could have confronted actually what was going on. And earlier on, Vicky said something that I think was really important, which is sort of that in therapeutic terms, that there is only one way to go to get through the darkness. You can't really go around it. You can't jump around it. You actually got to go through it. And there's a lesson there for all of us, particularly this time, but also in our individual lives. Okay, so let's continue on with the Baal Shem Tov. And in his sacred worship, the basis of, I think it's really important, just the basis of the Baal Shem Tov's teachings is the idea, the notion that the earth is full of God's glory, that nothing is separated from God because God exists in all existence, right? So I think that's really important that everyone understands this, that, right, the Baal Shem Tov is saying that God, the God is embedded in everything, and that nothing exists separate from God. All existence includes God's divine presence. And so as we understand that, let's take a look for what he and then you'll see the questions, and you can read the questions or not read the questions, depends. Anyone want to read the Baal Shem Tov's Sacred Worship? Brenda, please.
She must be muted.
Brenda, you might be reading it. I think you're muted, Brenda. Sorry.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Baal Shem Tov, Sacred Worship. The earth is full of God's glory, and nothing, big or small, is separate from God, because God exists in all existences. Therefore, the complete person can bring unity to the upper worlds, even in earthly acts such as eating, drinking, sexual intercourse, business, and in one's mundane talk with friends. It leads to the question, what does it mean that the earth is full of God's glory?
And will you read the next question too?
Sure. If God's presence is found in all of the world, then divinity is found even in the mundane acts of eating, drinking, sexuality, business, etc. What would it mean to bring unity to the upper worlds? Through those mundane acts, how can we do this? How would we do this?
All right. So let's take a moment. If you want to take off the text, Tracy, that'd be awesome. So just so we can see everyone. So how would we do that? How would we connect to the or maybe Tracy, if you can actually reshare it, so in case people wanted to take a moment to reread what was actually being said. I shouldn't have taken that off. I apologize. But what does it mean to have that the earth is full of God's unity?
It's to acknowledge that God created everything and everything belongs to God, and that we use it with care.
Including the good times and the dark clouds. Right? God is embedded in everything. Right? Brenda, did you raise your hand?
Yes, I did. I wanted to tell I hope a small story. Many years ago, I was in school and I was writing a paper on interfaith marriages. I was lucky enough to get an appointment with the Monsignor. And when I asked him about interfaith marriages, he gave me many, many pages on birth control. But I had asked him, how come the priests won't marry outside the church? And he said, because God isn't outside the church. And I directly said, but Monsignor, I was taught that God is everywhere. And he didn't answer, but I remember that he answered.
Yeah, that is. I don't know if I understand his response. I also understand yours a lot more too. I mean, identify with what you're saying, Brenda. I mean, right. So the idea there is that there is only one path with which one can find God, and here we have this sort of notion that God is quite literally everywhere. God fills the entire world, and that there is no place devoid. I think what you're arguing, there's no place that's devoid of divinity. Right. And so in that, it's whether or not what I think what he's sort of getting. So let me ask David, if you want to go there, and I want to sort of get into what I think the Baal Shem Tov is actually arguing. So David, you want to say something?
There's an old saying that to define God is to limit him. So, which I agree with. So in that sense, God is not knowable per se. On the other hand, I would like to think that our world and people in it are knowable. So to address the question how the various mundane activities can bring unity to the upper worlds, namely our world, if I've understood the question correctly, I would say that the more we can understand ourselves, we can understand God's purpose in creating us, and in that way fulfill the commandment of exalting God's name. So that's what I get out of what it means that our actions here on earth help us demonstrate that the earth is full of God's glory, even though we don't totally understand what God is, as we seek to understand who we are and what we can be.
Yeah, I want to elevate and lift up what Jeff Schwartz put into the chat box, right? He said, faith is gratefulness for the good, the bad, the indifferent. It's practiced daily, not just when you think you most have faith. And I think to that point, right, is that what he's saying is that if faith is in all of these sort of the mundane realities, and we are able to bring awareness to who we are and to the idea of God through mindful practices of those mundane things, then what we're really doing is we're actually being more mindfully aware. We're bringing more gratefulness. We're bringing more sense of faith, and that the way that we sort of unite the upper and the worlds together is by actually a sense of mindful Jewish practice that is actually a matter of giving appreciation and thanks and showing love for a world that we don't necessarily understand, but for which we are encountering every single day in every single way, right? And that is, I think, what Jeffrey wrote and what Vicky just wrote, right? We more mindful and aware in everyday life that God is everywhere. That is a way, part of that sort of like that light that we're talking about in the darkness is if you can become mindfully aware of who you are and how you practice and the things that are going in your life, that's just that leads to a little light, a little sparkness that helps to sort of light your path through the darkness, right? Mindful practice, mindful awareness of who we are, of the gifts that we have, of appreciation, helps us to add enough light that can begin to sort of spread and help us through the dark places. Yeah, I saw some hands up, and I want to make sure. Who had Bob had his hand up, and then Ellen, I see your hand up as well.
Somebody already said it.
Okay, Ellen.
I think, but you need to, I think from the first author, you need to pay attention to see if you see the spark of light. So one of my favorite passages is that he noticed that the bush was burning unconsumed. And I just think there are bushes burning all over the place and we're not paying attention to it. So the whole attention, or if it's a spark, do we need to be an avalanche of fire? So I just think the paying attention is a really important point. And I think, why did Abraham get picked? I always think it's because he noticed that the bush was burning unconsumed.
But the right. And so what I would say is that what they're saying is that mundane practices, by bringing awareness to the mundane practices, that actually helps us to see the potential of God in the everyday.
Right. And we've said, make the mundane sacred. I mean, that's the parts that I think we're missing when people say, where are all the miracles? Well, just pay attention.
I mean, right. I mean,
popping you over your head, but
right. First miracle is that I got up today, and frankly, based on, I don't, my dog ran into my knee, and I might have a meniscus tear in my knee, so like that actually felt like a miracle today. Right, like it was like I'm awake, I'm there. And also, by the way, I also had some really amazing food for breakfast this morning. That was a really tasty strawberry, and had a conversation with my kiddos at breakfast, and like that was great. And then I had this, a staff meeting right before we got onto Zoom today, and then we're here today in this moment, and I'm seeing all of you a lot. Like, look at the godliness that is all around, right? Look at that. If we choose to see it, if we choose to see the light. And like, yeah, so I can look at it like, gosh, there's some dark things that have been happening in our worlds and our lives, and that all that does exist. And yet, if I stop and notice the goodness, it helps me traverse the difficult aspects of life. Bob?
Yeah, it's also a little self-contradictory in the sense that
Can't hear him.
there is no such thing as a moment.
Yeah, I don't hear him either.
Can't hear him.
Bob, we're having a hard time hearing you. Hold on for 1 second.
No, I have to rearrange things. I'm talking apparently through my hearing aids.
Oh, okay. All right. So, all right. So let's take a look at the next text real quick, and I might fast forward. I have to take a look. I don't have the text in front of me, so let me take a look at the next text.
Question on that one. What are they referring to with the upper world?
That's a sort of a notion that God is actually. We're going to skip that. We're going to skip that text. If it's just too long. So keep on going. So up. Hold on for 1 second. Right there. The upper world is a notion of like a divine world and sort of versus the mundane world, and that we can actually create sort of a divine, a sort of unification between what is sort of the divine realm and the earthly realm by the ways in which we act. And so that's sort of that notion, that idea. I'm gonna go ahead and read this just based on time. Hamutal Bar Yosef, in these moments, he says, in those moments when I believe in God, I see him gliding on the hot wind in the whiteness of butterflies which have just now emerged from their cocoons. And that same day is their wedding and their death, where I see him in a dandelion puff, when I sit on the warm steps and a wind suddenly disperses its seeds like a soft snow, and one seed floats into my lap, and there it rests. Right? I mean, just this sense of noticing the beauty that's all around, right? And that in that moment, there is just there's great possibility and great faith available. I want to just bring this back and recognizing the time. I had talked to someone this week who just said, I just can't deal with Omicron. And, and I hear that, I hear that there's still, even, practically 2 years into this, there's still unknowns that we're facing. And yet we have an incredible sense of resilience, not just into what we do, but sort of the how we do it. And that resilience sometimes occurs in how we gather together to light some candles, to turn off the lights and to see the flickering, beautiful light of the Chanukah, and to remind ourselves that we, through our lives and through our actions, as Hannah Arendt said, we can choose to bring light into this world. And we can choose to bring light forward. And part of the way that we find that light, that find enough resilience to light it, is, at least from the Hasidic texts, is to take a look for the goodliness and the godliness that exists in the everyday, and to recognize that the cloud that we seem to be walking through and walking in sometimes is also filled with godliness, should we choose to see it, right? And that there is godliness all around. And that faith is not something that we put, as Zelda said, into a box, but it's something that is part of us and filled and is the potential is always there. With that, I want to say to everyone a happy Hanukkah. We say Chag Urim Sameach. May this be, to translate it loosely, may the festival of lights bring joy, and may you see godliness and hope and possibility, and may you be like the Shamash and light the way forward for yourself, for your family, and for our community and for the world. Thanks everyone for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. That was beautiful ending, and
Thank you, Rabbi, and remind everybody that in 2 weeks, we have a program with a speaker from Israel directly on Zoom. It should be absolutely interesting,
Wonderful.
fascinating and interesting to everybody, so put it on your calendar. And we will now break into
I can't.
couple discussion rooms, either social or discussion, which either one you signed up for. So, and the best for the rest of the holiday. And thank you, Rabbi. I appreciate it.
Thank
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Rabbi, that was Janet who wrote that, not I, but I agree.
So, sounds good. Sorry to give wrong credit where credit is due. So appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye, everybody.
Rabbi.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Tracy. Hi, Nancy.
Hello, Brenda. How are you doing?
Good, I'm good. We missed you the other morning. At
What
the
was
board,
the other?
we had a board meeting.
Oh, my gosh. We
So
did?
who's there? Nancy?
Oh, my gosh.
Brenda, and who else?
How did I miss it?
Harry covered for you.
Good. When was it? Tuesday?
Yes, because of the holidays.
That's
That was
why.
the only day available.
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't. Boy, I missed that one.
I'm gonna send you to your
You were
breakout.
missed. You really were missed.
Was it a short meeting?
Not too short. It was okay.
I don't know what she was talking
All
about.
right, we'll join.
Yeah.
And I'm